Welcome back. Well, America and our allies firing more than 100 missiles at 3 military targets in Syria this weekend. And President Trump warns there will be more if Assad dares carry out another chemical attack.
So what does this mean for the economy, and what can we expect when the markets open tomorrow? Professor Brian Brenberg chairs the Business and Finance program at the King's College here in New York City, and he joins us now to weigh in. Brian, always good to have you, and such an important topic. I mean, you think about tomorrow morning and the reaction that we'll have in the markets. What do you think?
Now, in the short term, you might see markets drop just a little bit because you have this instability. But if you look at history,
only one use. Available at drugstores, supermarkets, and elsewhere.
Welcome back. Well, America and our allies firing more than 100 missiles at 3 military targets in Syria this weekend. And President Trump warns there will be more if Assad dares carry out another chemical attack.
So what does this mean for the economy, and what can we expect when the markets open tomorrow? Professor Brian Brenberg chairs the Business and Finance program at the King's College here in New York City, and he joins us now to weigh in. Brian, always good to have you, and such an important topic. I mean, you think about tomorrow morning and the reaction that we'll have in the markets. What do you think?
Now, in the short term, you might see markets drop just a little bit because you have this instability. But if you look at history, what tends to be the case is markets correct pretty quickly. They get back on track. These tend to be things that don't affect markets over the long term because they're limited. And the administration has been very clear talking about the limited precision of the strike here. They're trying to do one thing in particular. They're not trying to create a big conflict. And ultimately, that's what markets get a lot of comfort out of.
Brian, we've been entangled in the Middle East for decades because of dependency on energy and oil. You say that policy changes or realities of the United States have changed that equation.
This is such a big story. A decade or two ago, the real issue with anything going on in Syria or the Middle East would have been oil. But today, the U.S. is producing so much more oil than we did just a decade ago. That issue is really neutralized. When the world starts to get nervous about oil, the U.S. can step up and meet the need, both here and around the globe. So I don't think you're going to see oil price spiking the way you would have a decade or two ago.
So what do you attribute that to?
Well, it's really the shale oil revolution. I mean, West Texas and South Dakota, this is where you see the production coming online. You see much more supply than ever before. Over the next several years, 80% of global oil growth is going to come from the United States. That is the thing that will stabilize global markets when you have conflict like this. So from the U.S. perspective, this is great news. That technology has made a big difference, and it's the kind of thing that can continue to make a big difference into the future.
Because I in particular think about Russia. The reason they are still have any power is because they are so oil independent. People rely on Russia all over Europe for that oil. A reminder to us to get on our game, too.
Russia, Iran, all the big actors here have oil as their big lever. The U.S. can now walk onto the world stage and say you would have a decade or two ago.
So what do you attribute that to?
Well, it's really the shale oil revolution. West Texas and South Dakota, this is where you see the production coming online. You see much more supply than ever before. Over the next several years, 80% of global oil growth is going to come from the United States. That is the thing that will stabilize global markets when you have conflict like this. So from the U.S. perspective, this is great news. That technology has made a big difference, and it's the kind of thing that can continue to make a big difference into the future.
Because I in particular think about Russia. The reason they are still have any power is because they are so oil independent. People rely on Russia all over Europe for that oil. A reminder to us to get on our game, too.
Russia, Iran, all the big actors here have oil as their big lever. The U.S. can now walk onto the world stage and say, we've got enough oil to take care of our needs to help continue to foster global growth. The U.S. gets to play a very helpful role in that regard, but it's because we have this strategic asset that we've cultivated.
Brian, I thought we were a future was solar panels. Like, you're making environmentalist heads explode right now.
Well, look, they should be very, very happy that the U.S. can play the stabilizing role. Oil is helpful when it comes to peace. Oil is helpful when it comes to peace, and the U.S. can play a big role there.
Such a great point. Brian, always good to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
All right, well, the media quick to mock the president for saying mission accomplished yesterday on those Syria strikes.
Mission accomplished. Really not a wise thing to tweet.
What does mission accomplished mean?
Mission accomplished. Now, that's an interesting choice of words.
All right, well, is this just another attempt to create controversy where there is none? That's coming up next.
Plus, was the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton's email botched?
Gets to play a very helpful role in that regard, but it's because we have this strategic asset that we've cultivated.
A lot of similar taste in music. Do you know what movie this song was on?
No.
A walk to remember.
A walk to
I know
remember.
many
No, I don't
audience
know.
probably doesn't watch that show, but it was Mandy Moore.
Is
a great
this
flick.
not an amazingly powerful song? Dare
Great
You to
song.
Move?
It's a
Oh
good
my
song.
goodness.
Happy
Switchfoot.
Sunday morning to all of you.
Fantastic. If you haven't listened to it, Switchfoot, Dare You to Move. Thank you for being here. It's April 15th, Griff. Have you done your taxes?
No, should I? Is
You
it
might
today?
want to. It's due
Tuesday.
today, everybody. Run to the Sunday. You have 2 extra days, actually, from what I'm told. April 17th is
That's
the
right.
actual deadline
Yeah.
to get your taxes.
I would get going on that, Griff.
Listen, taxes are a sore subject for me, but I will be ready by Tuesday. But I've been caught up in the news,
prefer not
and
to.
that's
Yeah.
why we've got to talk about what's happened this weekend.
There's a lot, and a lot of reaction still from the airstrikes on Friday night. Nikki Haley, ambassador of the UN, ripping Russia over the Syria chemical weapons attack. Here she was speaking yesterday.
The United Kingdom, France, and the United States acted, not as revenge, not as punishment. We acted to deter the future use of chemical weapons by holding the Syrian regime responsible for its atrocities against humanity. The Russian disinformation campaign is in full force, but Russia's desperate attempts at deflection cannot change the facts. We obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. The United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line. We call on Russia to take a hard look at the company it keeps and live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council.
So that was Nikki Haley yesterday at the UN. You see that picture there. That picture is a vote that was taken because Russia brought a resolution to the Security Council. There's the Russian ambassador to the UN on the left with his hands down because everyone else is voting against it. They were trying to condemn the United States.
What did he think would
strikes.
happen in that meeting?
I think they're just trying to prove a point. Who voted with Russia? China did. And Bolivia, which is a client state.
Yeah,
of China.
well, and Nikki Haley speaking very directly to Kazakhstan, Ethiopia, Equatorial Guinea, and Peru, where Vice President Pence is, because they abstained. They did not have the guts to stand up and vote against condemning the U.S. for this precise strike.
You also just named the 4 countries I couldn't think less of. No, when's the last time I cared what Equatorial Guinea, Ethiopia, Kazakhstan, or Peru thought about what America did? Honestly, the UN proving how utterly irrelevant it is on the world stage.
Well,
who cares about this national security vote? If the other ones have voted, I don't know, Kuwait, Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, they should give out some more peace prizes that are ineffectual. Listen, it is, resolutions are silly. I think we should talk before we shoot. But the reality is, without the United States of America, chemical weapons would be proliferating around the world today. And President Trump stood up and said, I'll enforce your international norms with the U.S. military, with the Brits and the French together. Just think about the optics of that. Votes don't matter. What matters is what happens on the ground. People got gassed. And Americans acted. They should be thanking the world.
But also messaging matters a lot. And watching Nikki Haley there, I think she's done a great job.
Yeah.
But reminding America, but also reminding the world, as she said, that we are locked and loaded, because a lot of people are concerned about where this goes. Was this enough to pressure Bashar al-Assad? Are we going to be seeing another chemical attack a year from now? In her words, it's if they do cross that red line again, we will then act and potentially do more.
That's exactly right. Well, reaction in Congress, as you can predict, has been all over the map to the president's decision. Here's 3 examples of folks that have had differences of opinion on this. Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, called these strikes in Syria appropriate, but ... be careful. Senator Lindsey Graham says, quote, I fear this strike will be seen as a weak military response. And Justin Amash, known as an isolationist and a libertarian, he calls it unconstitutional, illegal, and reckless.
So had he gotten congressional approval, where would that have led to?
So tell me how he would have
Yeah.
gotten congressional approval in a timely basis.
I actually think it shows that the administration, the president, did something right here, because if you read the full statements by most of members of Congress, none of them say that they don't agree that something had to be done. And as we were talking about yesterday, it was such a delicate balance to get that right, to make sure that the mission was successful, that none of our own people were killed, and they weren't, as far as it's been reported, but also that the chemical weapons program was destroyed and that we were able to deter Assad, hopefully enough so that it doesn't happen again. But as I said, it is very delicate because there are so many different groups of people on the ground, and we could have very easily hit somebody or a specific group like the Russians who are there, and that would have resulted in a very bad situation.
Yeah, and we're seeing this mixed reaction in Congress because there was broad support to stand up against this atrocity under President Obama. He drew the red line. He did not enforce it. That failed. Now President Trump saying we are going to do it. And as I mentioned before, the 3 words that Lieutenant General McKenzie mentioned at that press briefing yesterday, precise, overwhelming, effective. I think that's right where it is.
You can't let rogue dictators run wild. President Obama set a red line he said he was going to enforce, and he never did. Trump just enforced Obama's red line. We live in a world where we're going to need red lines in the future, whether it's South China Sea with China building islands, whether it's North Korea and nuclear capabilities, whether it's Iran, that we're about to scrap that Iran deal, I hope. We're going to need to set red lines there. If your enemy doesn't believe they exist, they will never follow through on it. So the leftists want to enforce international norms like chemical weapons because they're obsessed with the international community and resolutions and the Hague and the UN, all this stuff that is ineffectual today. Trump understands international norms because without America enforcing them, as I said before, no one else enforces them. So Lindsey Graham doesn't like it because he wants the regime change, and that would lead to nation building and investment. That's not what Trump ran on. Justin Amash doesn't like it because he doesn't want any intervention anywhere.
Right.
I think Trump found, as you said,
a balance,
the exact balance to enforce American leadership, but not get us bogged down, and hopefully send the right signal.
It was interesting, and some of our best conversations with our guests happen in commercial breaks as we're getting to know their perspective.
We should film them.
And Buck Sexton, we were talking to him yesterday, and he said something he's concerned about is Bashar al-Assad being able to just recreate the chemical weapons program within a matter of weeks because they have that material and they have support still from Russia, from Iran, from some of these other countries. How do we prevent that from happening? I think that's still a big question that exists, and that's, you hear from a lot of lawmakers, what is the long-term strategy?
Exactly.
How do we make sure that doesn't happen?
We didn't bomb every chemical facility. It's not difficult, as Buck said, to reconstitute chlorine and sarin. They're pretty unsophisticated chemicals. The idea is not, you can't bomb everyone everywhere. It's to deter them from continuing development because they know they'll get hit again and hit harder.
And McKenzie, Lieutenant General McKenzie, saying yesterday that they had degraded, set back for years their ability to reproduce. We'll find out if that happens. But I think to your point, you're right. It's stuck in that perfect balance between not getting bogged down in a Bush war and not being weak like Obama was.
Well, before all of this happened on Friday night, everyone was talking about James Comey and his book that is going to be released on Tuesday. And the interview airs tonight with George Stephanopoulos. And we've been getting some clips from that interview, some snippets of what you can expect. And one that has caused a lot of eyebrows to be raised is this moment where George Stephanopoulos asked him about releasing that letter. Remember when he reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton emails just days before the election in October 2016, asked him about that decision and sort of what ultimately prompted him to make that decision. And here's how that went.
At some level, wasn't the decision to reveal influenced by your assumption that Hillary Clinton was going to win?
It must have been. I don't remember consciously thinking about that, but it must have been. Because I was operating in a world where Hillary Clinton was going to beat Donald Trump. And so I'm sure that it was a factor, that she's going to be elected president. And if I hide this from the American people, she'll be illegitimate the moment she's elected, the moment this comes out.
He was operating in a world where Hillary Clinton was going to be president of the United States, based his decisions based on that assumption. Just let that sink in. That is effectively, whether he was doing it consciously or subconsciously, a baked-in political bias in our intelligence agencies. And he was doing it to make her look legitimate as opposed to illegitimate. Turns out the people wanted someone else.
Well, he said his decision wouldn't have changed had he known or had the polls been different. But once he made that statement, it's hard to really know.
In the book, he writes also about a conversation he has with President Obama about feeling guilty about possibly costing Hillary the election. And it's a very interesting read, I will tell you.
You've read a lot of the book already, Griff.
Look, I'm a reporter. I'm looking to see if there's some facts, if he's setting the record straight. I didn't find much of that yet, but I haven't read the whole thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of tabloid stuff in there.
Well, yeah, there's a lot, as you mentioned, a lot of, here's Trump. I mean, Trump sells books, he sells newspapers, he helps a lot of things. Comey doubles down on that.
All right, well, more on that later in the show, but I do want to bring you some other headlines we're following closely this morning, starting with extreme weather. Cities across the Midwest are under snow emergencies. Did you hear this, Pete?
No.
I did.
The treacherous storm
My flight is canceled.
This is frightening, claiming at least 3 lives in Minnesota, where Pete is from. Troopers responding to more than 400 crashes across that state. The snow canceling an entire 3-game series between the Chicago White Sox and Minnesota Twins.
They should play that game.
Ooh, could you imagine? Blizzard conditions forcing the Nebraska governor to declare an emergency. Some parts are expected to receive up to 18 inches of snow. 18! The same brutal system now heading to the East Coast. Wonderful.
No, not welcome.
Also, the Justice Department sending more letters to sanctuary cities demanding proof that they aren't withholding information from federal immigration authorities. Seattle, Oakland, California, and the state of Vermont have until next month to hand over the documents, or they could be subpoenaed. Officials sent a similar letter back in January. Stay tuned for that. And a powerful rocket launch blasts military satellites into space.
3, we have ignition. 2, 1, and liftoff.
A combined 2.6 million pounds of thrust pushing the 20-story Atlas V rocket into space from Cape Canaveral. It carried an Air Force satellite and a free-flying spacecraft carrying Pentagon-funded experiments. The satellite will operate some 22,000 miles above the equator. Wow.
I'm just glad to see our military's launching rockets into space.
It's such a Pete response.
That's all I took away from that entire story. Launch a few more. All right. Well, after the airstrikes in Syria, will ISIS terrorists retaliate? It's a real threat that has law enforcement on high alert. How worried should you be?
And where is Melania? Once an icon in the magazine industry, are editors now turning a blind eye to the First Lady since Trump took office? We're going to debate that coming up in the show.
So true.
We don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore like we used to do.
NYPD stepping up security in and around New York City in the hours following the airstrikes against Syria. So should Americans be on high alert for terror retaliation? Let's ask former FBI special agent and founder of the Jenkins Group, Chad Jenkins. Chad, thanks for joining us. So obviously, when you strike in the Middle East, there's a potential for blowback. But in this particular case, we're striking a more or less secular dictator who's been fighting against ISIS imperfectly, but really fighting for his own power. Should we worry about Islamic groups striking us back as a result?
Yeah, it shows just the complicated situation we're in Syria and all of the Middle East, Pete. Looking at this, we always have to be, every American has to be keenly aware of the potential of terrorist attacks that come from those that are fundamental in their belief that they're doing the work of, of Muhammad and of Islam and conducting those attacks, which would be completely false. And ISIS is still going to be that group that tries to do that here at the United States. But specifically looking at the attacks that we conducted, the airstrikes on Friday against the Syrian regime in Douma, which targeted innocent civilians as well as the rebel forces. Those rebel forces located in Douma really would be more like-minded with ISIS than they are,
yes.
with the Syrian regime.